The war against ISIS was one of the bloodiest conflicts the U.S. military faced in the 21st century. From brutal executions to ambushes in the deserts of Iraq and Syria, ISIS used every method imaginable to terrorize American soldiers. The rise of ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, was one of the most rapid and brutal takeovers the world has ever seen. Though it officially declared itself in 2014, its roots went back more than a decade earlier. Originally an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS was far more extreme in its tactics and ambitions. While Al-Qaeda focused on attacking Western countries, ISIS aimed to build an Islamic State across Iraq and Syria, enforcing its rule through terror. On June 10, 2014, ISIS launched a full-scale attack on Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, home to over 1.5 million people. The assault was swift and overwhelming. The Iraqi army, which had over 30,000 soldiers stationed in the city, collapsed within days, abandoning their weapons and equipment. The advancing ISIS forces seized a massive amount of U.S.-supplied military gear, including Humvees, tanks, rifles, and ammunition. The fall of Mosul was a turning point. Just a few weeks later, on June 29, 2014, ISIS officially declared itself a caliphate, with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as its leader. The group claimed to rule all Muslims worldwide, and its forces continued their brutal expansion. Within months, ISIS controlled one-third of Iraq and a significant portion of Syria, including major cities like Raqqa, Fallujah, and Tikrit. The horrific acts of ISIS could not be ignored. In August 2014, the United States launched Operation Inherent Resolve, a military campaign aimed at destroying ISIS through airstrikes, intelligence support, and direct military intervention. The first major action under OIR took place on August 8, 2014, when U.S. warplanes bombed ISIS positions near Erbil, Iraq. The airstrikes targeted ISIS convoys, supply routes, and command centers. The goal was to stop ISIS from advancing further and to weaken their strongholds. At first, the U.S. focused on air power and supporting local allies, including the Iraqi military, Kurdish Peshmerga forces, and the Syrian Democratic Forces. But it soon became clear that airstrikes alone would not be enough. By late 2014, American special forces were deployed in Iraq and Syria to assist local troops in the fight against ISIS. Their mission was to train, advise, and provide intelligence. But it didn't take long before U.S. soldiers found themselves in direct combat. In October 2015, U.S. Delta Force operators took part in a prison raid in Hawija, Iraq, rescuing 70 hostages who were about to be executed by ISIS. During the mission, Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler was killed, the first U.S. soldier to die in combat against ISIS. As the war escalated, so did the dangers. ISIS responded to U.S. military actions with suicide bombings, roadside IEDs, and brutal ambushes. American troops stationed at bases in Iraq and Syria came under constant rocket and mortar attacks. ISIS quickly made its stance clear. Any American soldier captured would not be treated as a prisoner of war. Unlike traditional conflicts where captured soldiers might be used for negotiations, ISIS had no intention of following international rules. One of the most horrific examples of ISIS's brutality was the beheading of American journalist James Foley on August 19, 2014. The execution was filmed and broadcast online, serving as a direct threat to the U.S. government. Just weeks later, another American journalist, Steven Sotloff, was executed in the same manner. U.S. soldiers knew that falling into ISIS hands meant torture, humiliation, and execution. There were reports that captured individuals were burned alive, drowned in cages, or blown up with explosives, all filmed as propaganda. One of the most infamous cases involving the American soldiers was the brutal execution of Peter Kassig in November 2014. Kassig was not an active duty soldier at the time of his capture, but he had served as an army ranger before becoming a humanitarian worker in Syria. While delivering aid, he was kidnapped by ISIS militants. Kassig was held hostage for months, enduring unknown horrors before his final moments. Unlike previous ISIS execution videos where hostages were forced to speak before their deaths, the footage of Kassig's execution was different. His actual beheading was not shown, only his severed head. Intelligence agencies believed this was because he fought back against his captors, refusing to give them the propaganda they wanted. Another tragic example was the death of Navy SEAL Charles Keating IV on May 3, 2016. Keating was part of a quick reaction force sent to assist Kurdish Peshmerga fighters in Telskov, northern Iraq. The Kurds had been holding off ISIS attacks in the region, but on that day, more than 100 ISIS fighters launched a massive assault using machine guns, mortars, and suicide bombers. Keating and his team arrived in armored vehicles, immediately engaging the enemy. As they fought, the situation became more desperate. ISIS militants had snipers and RPG teams positioned around the battlefield. Keating, known for his bravery, pushed forward, trying to hold the line and protect his team. During the battle, he was shot by ISIS fighters. His fellow SEALs attempted to evacuate him under heavy fire, but he died before reaching medical help. His loss was a devastating blow, as he was one of the most skilled operators in the fight against ISIS. On October 4, 2017, one of the most shocking and tragic attacks occurred when 4 U.S. soldiers were ambushed in Niger by ISIS-affiliated militants. The soldiers, Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, and Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright, were part of a small Special Forces unit conducting a mission with Nigerian troops. The team was returning from a meeting with local leaders when they were suddenly attacked by over 100 heavily armed fighters. The Americans, armed with only rifles and light machine guns, were outnumbered and outgunned. The militants had rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and technical vehicles, making escape nearly impossible. For over an hour, the soldiers fought for their lives, using every bit of cover they could find. They radioed for help, but due to the remote location, air support took time to arrive. Their ammunition ran low, and they were forced into close-quarters combat. One by one, the soldiers were killed. Sergeant LaDavid Johnson's body was found 2 days later, over a mile from the ambush site, showing that he had tried to escape, but was ultimately hunted down. Reports indicated that at least one of the soldiers had been mutilated after death. The Niger ambush shocked the American public. Many were unaware that U.S. troops were even operating in the region, and the scale of the attack raised questions about how prepared American forces were to handle the growing ISIS threat in Africa. One of the most lethal and feared weapons used by ISIS against American troops was the improvised explosive device, or IED. These bombs were cheap, easy to make, and incredibly destructive, making them a preferred method of attack. Now, unlike traditional battlefield engagements where soldiers could see their enemy, IEDs turned the roads and cities into deadly traps. Every step, every vehicle, and every doorway could be hiding an explosion. IEDs came in many forms. Some were buried under roads, waiting for a Humvee or armored truck to pass over them. Others were hidden in abandoned vehicles or even inside dead animal carcasses to avoid detection. In urban combat, ISIS militants placed IEDs inside buildings so that when American troops cleared a house, a simple tripwire or pressure plate would set off an explosion. Between 2014 and 2019, IEDs were responsible for killing hundreds of American troops and wounding thousands more. These devices didn't just cause immediate casualties. They often resulted in severe, life-altering injuries, including lost limbs, burns, and traumatic brain injuries. One of the earliest known U.S. casualties from an ISIS IED attack was Marine Staff Sergeant Louis Cardin, who was killed in March 2016 while deployed in northern Iraq. Cardin and his unit were hit by an ISIS rocket attack, which was later found to be paired with secondary IED explosives. The attack left multiple Marines wounded. In April 2016, Army Specialist Ethan Conrad was killed in Mosul when his convoy struck a roadside bomb. His vehicle was heavily armored, but the force of the explosion was so powerful that it ripped through the protection, killing him instantly. ISIS took IED warfare to a new level, learning from previous insurgents and enhancing their attacks. They used advanced remote detonators, meaning they could trigger explosions from a safe distance. One of the most feared ISIS strategies was the SVB IED, or the Suicide Vehicle-Borne IED. These were vehicles, often ordinary cars or trucks, packed with thousands of pounds of explosives and driven at high speeds towards U.S. convoys or military bases. Unlike traditional car bombs, these vehicles were heavily reinforced with metal plates so they could withstand gunfire and reach their targets before exploding. During the battle for Mosul in 2017, American and Iraqi forces faced hundreds of SVB IED attacks. ISIS militants would modify bulldozers, trucks, and even ambulances, filling them with explosives and sending them straight into U.S. positions. Some of these vehicles were powerful enough to destroy entire buildings. American forces quickly adapted their tactics to counter IEDs. They deployed bomb-detecting drones, robotic bomb squads, and trained military dogs to sniff out explosives before they could be detonated. Special mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles were used to protect soldiers from roadside bombs. These vehicles had V-shaped hulls designed to deflect the blast away from passengers. Despite these efforts, IEDs remained the deadliest threat to U.S. troops. The constant danger meant that American soldiers had to be hyper-vigilant, scanning every piece of debris, every parked car, and every pile of trash for signs of hidden explosives. ISIS fighters were known for their unmatched cruelty, using extreme tactics to spread terror and inflict maximum casualties. One of the most shocking and heartbreaking tactics ISIS used was the recruitment of child soldiers, often referred to as cubs of the caliphate. These children, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, were kidnapped or brainwashed and trained to kill. Many were forced to carry out suicide attacks. In 2016, a 10-year-old boy detonated an explosive vest near an American patrol in Syria, killing 2 U.S. troops. The child had been seen moments before playing with a group of other kids, making it nearly impossible for soldiers to recognize him as a threat. When the U.S. troops passed by, the boy's handlers remotely detonated his vest, killing him and the American soldiers instantly. These attacks were deeply disturbing because they forced American troops to second-guess every interaction with children in ISIS-controlled areas. The militants knew that U.S. soldiers would hesitate to harm a child, and they exploited that hesitation to carry out deadly attacks. ISIS fighters were also masters of deception, using fake surrenders, ambushes, and psychological warfare to lure American soldiers into deadly situations. One such attack occurred in Fallujah, Iraq, when Marine First Lieutenant Alexander Weatherby and his unit were tricked into an explosive trap. The Marines had been clearing an area of ISIS militants, fighting house by house. As they pushed forward, a small group of ISIS fighters emerged from a building, waving white flags. Weatherby and his men approached cautiously, expecting the militants to lay down their weapons. But as the Marines got closer, the ISIS fighters detonated hidden explosive vests, killing Weatherby and 3 of his men instantly. The explosion also injured several others, some losing limbs from the sheer force of the blast. ISIS wanted their violence to be seen, feared, and remembered. They developed an entire propaganda network dedicated to spreading their brutality. Unlike other terrorist groups that carried out secret executions, ISIS filmed their killings in high definition, edited them like movies, and broadcasted them online. One of the most horrifying cases was in 2015, when a captured U.S. contractor was burned alive in a cage. The execution was filmed in gruesome detail, showing how the flames engulfed his body while ISIS fighters cheered. The video was spread across social media, with ISIS hoping it would terrify American soldiers and make them fear entering ISIS-held territory. The battle for Mosul was one of the most brutal urban battles of the 21st century, lasting from October 17, 2016 to July 9, 2017. It was an all-out war between ISIS and the coalition of U.S. forces, Iraqi troops, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, and other allied forces. The battle was fought street by street, house by house, in some of the most intense combat scenes since World War II. Mosul was ISIS's stronghold in Iraq, and they had spent over 2 years fortifying the city before the battle began. The streets were laced with IEDs, entire buildings were booby-trapped, and ISIS fighters had built an underground tunnel network to launch surprise attacks. Thousands of civilians were trapped in the city, used as human shields by ISIS to slow down U.S. and Iraqi forces. During the battle, U.S. soldiers played a crucial role, especially in clearing explosives and supporting Iraqi forces with airstrikes and special operations raids. One of the first American casualties in this fight was Navy SEAL Senior Chief Petty Officer Scott Dayton. On November 24, 2016, Dayton was leading an explosives disposal team in Syria, just outside of Mosul, when an IED detonated underneath him. He became the first American service member killed in Syria during the war against ISIS. Another tragic moment came in April 2017, when Army Sergeant Joshua Rogers and Sergeant Cameron Thomas were killed in a deadly raid on an ISIS hideout in eastern Mosul. Their Special Operations Unit had been tracking a high-profile ISIS leader who was believed to be hiding in an underground bunker. The team moved in under the cover of night, but as soon as they breached the compound, ISIS fighters ambushed them from multiple directions. Rogers and Thomas were caught in the crossfire, but they kept fighting, giving their teammates a chance to escape. And despite being outnumbered, they held their position until their last breath, allowing the rest of the unit to regroup and push forward. As the battle raged on, ISIS fighters turned the city into a living nightmare for American and coalition troops. Suicide bombers would charge at advancing soldiers, detonating themselves in narrow streets. Snipers hid in minarets and high-rise buildings, picking off U.S. and Iraqi troops. Booby-trapped corpses exploded when soldiers tried to move them. Drones rigged with explosives were used to drop bombs on U.S. forces. Despite these ruthless tactics, U.S. and Iraqi troops pushed forward block by block, clearing the city with airstrikes and relentless assaults. Raqqa, Syria, was the heart of ISIS's so-called caliphate, its de facto capital and the center of its operations. The city was where ISIS planned attacks, spread propaganda, and ruled with extreme brutality. It was filled with training camps, bomb factories, and execution sites. By 2017, the U.S. and its allies knew that taking Raqqa was the key to crushing ISIS. In June 2017, U.S.-backed forces, including the Syrian Democratic Forces and elite American troops, launched a massive offense to reclaim the city. The battle lasted 4 months and was one of the most intense urban fights of the war. By July 2017, Mosul was finally liberated, but at an enormous cost, as thousands of soldiers and civilians had died, and the city was left in ruins. The victory was significant, marking the beginning of the end for ISIS's so-called caliphate. But the terror did not end there. On March 29, 2018, a tragic event shook U.S. forces in Syria. Army Master Sergeant Jonathan Dunbar and British soldier Sergeant Matt Tonroe were on a high-risk mission to capture an ISIS leader in Raqqa. As their team moved through a heavily bombed-out section of the city, an IED hidden in the rubble exploded. The blast killed both Dunbar and Tonroe instantly. Several others were wounded. Despite losing Raqqa, ISIS still controlled a small strip of land along the Euphrates River. In March 2019, U.S. forces helped launch an attack on Baghouz, Syria, the last ISIS stronghold. By this point, ISIS fighters were desperate, fighting to the death with suicide bombers, child soldiers, and hidden tunnel networks. After weeks of airstrikes and ground combat, the final ISIS pocket collapsed. On March 23, 2019, the so-called ISIS Caliphate was officially destroyed. The once mighty terror group had been reduced to a scattered network of fugitives and underground cells. But even after their defeat, ISIS fighters continued launching surprise attacks, using sleeper cells to ambush American patrols and assassinate local leaders. The fall of Raqqa and Baghouz ended their control over territory, but the group remained a persistent threat, one that U.S. forces would have to keep fighting for years to come. The fight against ISIS came at a huge cost. By 2019, over 100 American soldiers had been killed in combat against ISIS, and thousands more were injured. The war left many soldiers with lifelong scars, both physical and mental.